Hi everyone, welcome to Groundhog Day. Thank you for being punctual and joining us. I do see that we still have people streaming in, so in the interest of reminding everyone how we're going, I will periodically remind us on which sessions we're in and how we are going to be communicating for the rest of the day. But for starters, please let me welcome all of you to this event hosted by the Influencer Ethnography Research Lab. We are a group of interdisciplinary and international scientists who focus on the social sciences and humanities, and we primarily study the social cultural impact of influencers in the APAC region. But today we're very pleased to host our first public event in conjunction with a few other people and a few other academics to look at a series of conversations regarding the cyclical nature of moral panics. To begin, before I properly introduce the structure for today and our panelists, I think we need to take a moment to acknowledge what moral panics are. Now, a lifetime ago, my first degree was in sociology, and one of my pet areas was the sociology of deviance. A very famous scholar, Cohen, tells us that moral panics generally occur when the interests or the sentiments of a group of people start to emerge to become a threat, or they feel like they are trying to upset what the status quo is or what the norm is in society. But as we know, social cultural values, norms, and mores, they're all very flexible and constantly negotiable. And we also see this happening as the generations go by. Now, to make sure that I'm very up to date with this, I am literally opening my google.com screen right now. I have just typed in millennials are killing. And for today, in incognito mode, here are what millennials are killing: musical reviews, American cheese, mayonnaise, bar soap, musicals, life expectancy, so on and so forth. Now, this applies to basically every other generation. If I were to do the same for Gen Z, Boomers, Gen X, there are moral panics about all of these generations that seem to change by the week, depending on Google Trends. If we were to shift away from the generational perspective to go towards something like a cohort perspective, so by the decade, you will see that the moral panics are also being reversed and cycled through many different iterations of technology. Today would be Zoom, laptops, iPhones, devices. Not too long ago, it was television, radio, cinema, dance. And not too long ago before that, it was newspapers and magazines, and the list goes on. So the objects of these moral panics tend to cycle over and over, which brings us to the topic for today, Groundhog Day, based on a movie I used to love as a child, where Bill Murray would wake up and find himself in the same situation day after day after day. So in our next slide, you'll see that Groundhog Day is a one-day, online-only, open access collection of roundtables. We're going to be discussing the cyclical nature of academic spotlights and hot topics, and a lot of the frustrations related to the ahistorical discussions about moral panics. Some of the cycles, patterns, templates, fatigue that we'll chat about today include influencers, digital media and sexuality, mental health, as well as memes. If you'd like to follow along, we do have a very dedicated team doing live tweeting on IERLab_TW or hashtag IERLabGD23. But now let me kick off with the next slide. We start off with thanks as usual. I'm very grateful to have some conspirers, good friends, but also really well-renowned colleagues in the areas like Professor Kath Elbry, Dr. Natalie Hendry, and Dr. Gabriel Di Seta, not only join us as hosts today, but to join us as co-organizers to curate the discussions as they go on throughout the day. This event is supported by the Faculty of Humanities here at Curtin University and also by an ARC DECRA grant. I do want to also start by thanking my very dedicated IERLab team, Alex, Kristen, River, Jill, and Naomi for putting this together. And without further ado, it is my greatest honor to now give us a welcome to country via Emeritus Professor Simon Forrest. Naomi, please, for the transition.
Kaya Wandu. Hello and welcome. My name is Simon Forrest Burungu. I am a Wajak Baladong Noongar with kin connections to Yamaji and Wongai peoples. I am of this land and place. I follow a bloodline of people who have walked and cared for this land for over 40,000 years. This is a welcome to country, a welcome to Wajak Noongar Boodja. A welcome to country recognises and acknowledges us and the first and continuing custodians of this land, Australia. Nidja Bolo, Nidja Gungungap, Nidja Maragarap, Nidja Mindarap. Kaya Wanju, Nan Kwel, Salmon Forest Burungu. Kaya Wanju, Nidja Wajak Noongar Boodja. Nal Karich Noongar Mood. Ken Karat Nidja Boodja. Nan Karich Noongar Kabali Borankoriye.
Thank you to Emeritus Professor Simon Forrest. And with that, we welcome you here to Curtin University. And we also like to kick off our first session for today. Influencers are just vain. Can I please invite Srikanth, Earvin, and Jia to the screen? And before we kick off, let me give us a little bit of an orientation. Now, I first started looking at influencers in 2005, back when they used to be called bloggers. And even in those days, not too long ago, people used to circulate a lot of discourse over how these are just young women selling clothes on the internet. It's just a bunch of skinny girls, pretty boys, looking like they're living their best life. And maybe to no surprise, almost 20 years on, if you were to type in any news article that's been published just this month, the same sentiments are here, despite the fact that there's been such an explosion in scholarship in papers, commentaries, books, PhD theses even, that tell us about the importance and the power of influencers across diverse geographical regions. So on that note, I'm really, really grateful to have three wonderful emerging ECR and HDR scholars join us today. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves by kicking off with this one question. So for Earvin, Jia, and Srikanth, very tricky, in 1 minute, tell us what aspect of influencers you study so we get an orientation of the lay of the land. Go ahead.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Srikanth Nayaka. I'm just submitted my PhD thesis at Indian Institute of Technology last month, titled YouTube Online Videos Creator Labor in Rural South India. In my project, in my doctoral dissertation, I've explored how a group of people went viral and tried to platformize their creator labor. And I started off this particular question a few years back in 2018, when I came across this viral video called Kiki Challenge. And after watching this video, I thought that, what happened to these people, and tried to want to discover them. So eventually I ended up doing a PhD on that topic, that how these rural creators are professionalizing. So in my project, basically I looked at trying to argue that how this has become a kind of a digital labor, a kind of platformized, monetized digital labor, against other arguments saying that, most of the digital labor is exploitative and free.
Thank you, Srikanth. How about Earvin?
Okay, thank you very much, Crystal, for that really excellent introduction on the topic. But in terms of my research, so I actually look at the impacts of digital communication technologies and online platforms on the lives of migrants and their networks overseas. But what gravitated me towards understanding this phenomenon of content creation, not only for family members and peers, but becoming kind of like in the context of content production in the context of the public or transnational public. And that got me into looking at how, for example, platforms are shaping the lives of migrants in curating their everyday life on a platform such as TikTok, YouTube, but also thinking about the kind of like complexity and nuances in that particular space, wherein there's so much production of content, but allowing agency, but also issues surrounding, for example, misinformation and other kind of like unregulated content. So there's a recognition of the types of content in my work for migrant influencers, particularly Filipino migrant influencers, not only in Australia, but across the world, but also unpacking how those practices may tell us about, you know, the kind of like inequalities in a global digital economy, wherein there are individuals, for example, migrant influencers, connecting not only to a public in their host country, but also connecting to people dispersed across the world, such as in the case of Filipino migrants in that perspective. But I'm also approaching my work through the lens of brokering, which I built on my book, collaborative book with Cheryl Soriano on Philippine digital cultures, brokerage dynamics on YouTube, and really thinking about this kind of like shift wherein we now have influencers becoming what you call, Crystal, like conduits of information and depicting a picture of what is alive overseas through social media platforms. That's it.
Thank you, Earvin. And we have Jia.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Just thanks for having me here. My name is Jia, and I just received my PhD in May this year from University of Sydney. I'm working as a research assistant in the influencer ethnography research lab, and I'm also teaching in UC right now. So in my research, I mostly study influencers on Chinese social media and also influencers with a Chinese background, especially from mainland China on Western social media. So I really focus on women, young women, and also queer groups. I focus on these influencers who engage with beauty, fashion, and lifestyle content. And also I'm really interested in like these influencers who talk about gender-related topics on social media. Yeah. So I think these two things I really focus in my research. One, of course, is the very special, unique Chinese context, and second, just the complexities within the influencer culture and their practice.
Thank you,
Yes.
Jia. To transit to our discussion about the moral panics and Groundhog Day around influencers, please allow me to share a little bit of insight. So I scoured through about 11 social media platforms, including forums like Reddit and very old blogs, to find out across the decades, what discourse have we been circulating over and over about influencers? So here are the top 5, not in any order, but 1, there's a lot of commentary on how influencers are really rich. Apparently, they're all swimming in money. And then as a pushback to that, we see then a rise of commentary and scholarship talking about how the inequities actually are very different for different people. There are barriers of entry for different groups. Who are we talking about when we think about the 1% of the influencers? Number 2, influencers are narcissists. They're just all vain on the internet, showcasing their faces. And then the pushback to that in the next news cycle always tells us how they are really leveraging on their face, appearance, and looks to parlay discussions to get people's attention to focus on specific things in society. 3, being an influencer is a lazy job because apparently you just sit at home and the computer's there. And the pushback to that, especially on Reddit, where a lot of creators were anonymously talking about this, said, actually, you know what? I am my one-man show. I am the photographer, content creator, manager, lawyer, contract signer, PA, laundry assistant, etc. So they're telling us about the everyday practice of being an influencer. 4, influencers are useless versus a lot of the very newest commentary in the age of misinformation about how influencers are actually very powerful for helping us think about things, where to suppress and where to amplify our attention. Last but not least, we always have to have a save the kids angle. Influencers are bad for young children. The pushback to discourse these days is the children are the influencers with the rise of vloggers, child unboxing YouTubers, and the like. So now for both of these areas where we talk about the generalization and the pushback, I would like to invite our 3 panelists to tell us, in your specific area, do you have a popular myth like that? Is there truth to it? What is the pushback? And perhaps we can start off with Srikanth, please.
In my project, I mean, like I said in my intro, that I am looked at rural content creators. One of the very interesting aspects of this discovery is that a lot of times we think that content creators have emerged through this blogs and with the rise of YouTube and TikTok and other platforms. But there is a very interesting media ecology existing in India in 1970s and 80s. We have this subcultural parallel to mainstream content creation culture is there. So especially the cassette culture and at the same time CDs and DVDs culture. So one of the very interesting things about rural content creators is that a lot of these subcultures talked about that these creators are kind of produce vernacular creativity kind of content and low in production values, and this has been a kind of a dominant understanding. And what I could able to do in this in the platformized thing, this is not this kind of a myth is not there. A lot of these rural content creators, at least in my case study, have been like fully professionalized on par with other kind of mainstream industries. I've discovered they are building in kind of a studios in their villages, and they are acquiring latest technologies of very high-end technologies, and at the same time they are also deploying very sophisticated kind of formats. For example, they have kind of for Instagram, they have 1 minute short reel web series kind of stuff. So what is interesting is that content creators, rural content creators in India is something, especially in South India, a lot of this professionalizing is happening. And one of the very interesting things which I've discovered is that why they are professionalizing was because they want to be the adopting or embedding themselves to the production logics of YouTube, like algorithms, pushing the content of original content, and at the same time a lot of this YouTube putting emphasis on original content and creative content, unlike taking content other copyright content. So one of the popular myths in my project which I've discovered was that rural content creators are investing a lot of their energy and time in creating original content, at the same time platformizing and professionalizing. So when I look this case with the earlier subcultural forms, what is interesting is that most of these creators are like, have kind of, it's also very interesting that most of these content creators identifying themselves like how. Earlier in subcultural forms, most of the creators are identifying as a kind of actors and kind of cameraman like that. In today's content creators, mostly identifying themselves as like, micro celebrities, influencers. In fact, within the group which I did my PhD on, few are identifying themselves as influencers. So popular myth is that these creators are identifying as influencers because how the market is approaching them. Like if they are being approached by certain people to promote their product, they think that they are kind of influencers. Despite having a lot of subscribers, few people have been not part of this influencer thing. Not many sponsors have been come to them and ask them to promote their products. So this is also very interesting. I discussed in my project that who becomes influencer, whether market decides them as influencer or else they themselves become influencer. That's important thing which I explored in my project. Thank you.
Thank you, Srikanth. Earvin?
Yeah, so I think in my work, stepping back, when we start thinking about migrant workers, particularly Filipino migrant workers, there's a specific subjectivity being attached to that particular figure, right? So in the context of the Philippines, that figure is expected to become self-sacrificing, entrepreneurial, trying to being docile, particularly in an employment kind of like condition. But what's interesting when that migrant becomes an influencer, Crystal and everyone in here, right? Because they're basically showing their lives overseas, and often this curation of their everyday lives overseas, they're in kind of like tidbits or pockets. So one video is about this, one video is about that, one video is about this. What's emerging in my research is that because of that ascribed subjectivity to a particular migrant, that becomes kind of like stepping point to engage with a particular content through a moral compass. So for example, if a migrant is actually showcasing, for example, buying a shoes, or for example, having all of these clothes for that particular video, then the audience is actually kind of like criticizing that as related to what you're saying, Crystal, a while ago, like, these people are just probably rich and they're not doing their job because they're there spending their money on these lavish things. So that's an issue. But then again, the migrant will be pushing back that actually you don't understand the context. You know, this is the context collapse aspect that you have so many viewers in your platform. So the audience doesn't actually kind of like understand that that migrant actually bought that particular outfit or clothing or something for that particular celebration or a moment or stuff like that. But that's being interpreted as kind of like being lavish, as kind of like contradictory to this idea that you're a migrant, you're just sending money back home and stuff like that. Another pushback is that there are gendered kind of like constructs attached to specific migrants in my work. For example, when I started looking at this influencer, she's in Australia, Filipina, married to an Australian man. So she's actually curating her everyday life on YouTube, all of her activities, travels, lifestyle, and even her hardships, right? But then people interpret that actually you are a gold digger, you are just using the money of your husband to buy things. That judgment is a moral judgment, and it's actually shaped by the socio-historical context of the Philippines, wherein women, for example, automatically married to white men would be kind of like a gold digger or a slut in that space. So that's very discriminatory. But we need to also think about pushbacks, which we're saying, Crystal, because these influencers are also pushing back by commenting or creating videos, for example, on TikTok, responding to these accusations or judgments and stuff like that. But also, what's interesting in my work now, they're visibilizing the hardship in the life overseas. But I'm complicating that hardship because that kind of like visibilization of hardship, collective solidarity, is also attached to that neoliberal resilience, wherein the focus is the self, the family, the community, but not really thinking about questioning the role of the government, creating that pushing out of the country for these migrant workers. And I think that's a kind of like complexity when we start thinking about migrant influencers, that what they can be showing us could also be a kind of like, contesting what's, the judgment of people, but also what kind of like resilience or solidarities are actually created when we start thinking about this visibilization of performative visits in such digital spaces.
Thank you, Earvin. We've had Srikanth coming on the angle of rural creator, self-perception technologies. Earvin coming on the angle of migrant influencers being so surveyed and policed along racial lines and class lines. And Jia, over to China, where your focus is on queer influencers and women. What insights might you have?
So in my project, I think these are like two popular myths. The first is Crystal also just mentioned. It's just like, because I focus on beauty, fashion, and lifestyle influencers, there always is like thing to say, oh, this is just like young women who are like pretty young women doing the fun things. And the second, I think this is especially in some Western media press or in some people's minds, is that just like all Chinese people, especially women, of course, including those online, are just all controlled by this large party state machine. And there's no way that influencers in China could talk about any progressive thoughts related to gender or feminisms or LGBTQ rights online, because they're all sensitive topics. So I see my research, apparently those two are not true. So Chinese women, and also including LGBTQ groups, are always trying to have their own voice and more visibilities on social media. And also this gender-related topic, like in reality, are really attracting more and more attention, like more and more people's discussions on Chinese social media. And also many influencers, of course, are engaged with these topics too. And also I just really, my own like feminist belief, like feminism should be plural, that should be feminisms. So there are different aspects of patriarchal structures and like different aspects of gender discipline that women are facing in the real everyday daily life. And in like my project, I really look at like how this influencers, these young women kind of bring that discussions or these topics or their own reflections online. And also just even for influencers who don't directly comment on gender-related issues, they're also always negotiating with this kind of multi-layered gender class norms in China, like in context, through their online personas and also their online content. So like the self-representation, the online community, and also the entrepreneurial labor. So through all these things, they can really study the gender class norms and not just like the pushback of like they are just when people doing like useless, meaningless things. Yeah.
I think this is so complex because even across the 3 areas, we're not just looking at your geographical research, we're looking at the demographic of the specific influencer. And then within that, each of you are looking at a very key aspect of that demographic intention. I really like how Jia underscored that when we talk about feminism, it's really a plural endeavor. We talk about patriarchy. There are also so many distinctions and intersections we need to bear in mind. Now, in your area, given that you're experts on rural influencers, migrant influencers, and feminist queer activist influencers, can you please tell us one of the things that really you find lamentable? Are influencers vain or not? Are they stereotypable or not? And you know, oftentimes these adages, these perceptions, the stereotypes have some truth to it. So taking a step back from being too defensive about our fields, is there some truth to the myth? And then how can we look at this area differently to spot the diversity? Let's go backwards this time. So maybe we'll start with Jia.
Yeah, so I think one thing I want to like mention to respond this question is class, because I'm looking at like beauty, fashion, lifestyle influencers, and not only in China, I think around the world, there's also this kind of like stereotype, or maybe in many cases that is true. It is all these influencers kind of represent this like middle class femininity and also beauty standards, and they really promote consumerism. So, but I feel like even the stereotype in many cases, also in my own study, that is the case, but this doesn't mean they are one, just like I mentioned. So they are always negotiating with all these like norms, beauty norms, and like gender class orders through their online personas and also their online practice. And also just to mention in class. So in China, there are many like women who are from the so-called lower classes from the rural small towns, or like a migrant worker in big cities. So these women like are also doing beauty and fashion content, especially a lot of them are hosting this e-commerce live stream. So I just think like neither of these influences are one, just because from them, they could really study this interactions between class and femininity, women's aspirations and consumer cultures in China. And also, again, I just think they all have their own voice, and also they all have their like entrepreneurial pursuits in their online practice. But it's not like saying we should celebrate this phenomenon or like the femininity they represent or the comments they put on gender are not problematic. So what I have been doing and want to continue doing, just put my feminist critiques, and also just to really recognize the complexities of their online personas and their practices. So I think this, as a researcher, as a feminist scholar, or like just our critiques should always be towards the structure, such as the gender discipline, the party-state governance in China, and also the platform economy, which kind of around the world. So no judgment should be made on the individual women or LGBTQ groups who are trying to do the self-actualization through social media. Yeah.
Thank you, Jia. That was a really good summary on class and gender and structure. Earvin, over to you.
Yeah, so mine was actually more interesting in terms of like how migrant influencers actually create a space for visibilization, but also agency in a foreign country. Like, for example, some of the videos that I've been examining for the past months, they actually depict this migrant as becoming more of like, showcasing their hardships overseas, showcasing the challenges of being away from their family, even showcasing, for example, that sending of the returnee boxes filled with consumer goods for their family members and stuff like that. So these depictions are actually representing that figure of the ideal figure of a Filipino migrant worker, kind of like caring for the family, caring for the community. But what's actually interesting is that we know that these platforms are open for surveillance and policing. That's why in my analysis, I feel like these migrant workers are very careful as well to critique the government, but very few videos actually critique the Philippine government in that space. But very few actually critique the government for the hardships that they experience. Often the blaming of oneself is actually caused by the family members, the community members. And that's quite problematic in that space because, you know, we're not really thinking about what is actually causing all of these issues, which is caused by that lack of support by the government back home. And even in the host country, you know, for these migrants who are navigating the precarity. But what's also interesting, Crystal and everyone in here, is that this idea that people see that migrants romanticize their lives overseas when they show the good life and they show what they're actually doing overseas. And that's creating backlash for these influencers. But also there's a pushback for migrant workers saying that these are like moments that we're just trying to enjoy life. And obviously in our everyday life, it's really challenging, it's full of hardship. But then the TikTok space creates a space where they can dance to a tune, they can use a hashtag, they can create all of this kind of like narratives in that space. But I think it's also important to start thinking about like in the context of migrant influencers, they're now becoming what I call informal brokers in the digital space. So meaning we're actually moving from agencies, you know, migration institutions talking about, okay, you should migrate here, you should do that. But now we have migrants actually talking about how to migrate to a particular country. And they're showcasing that through their everyday life, through their everyday practices, and even sharing their understanding of the migration system and how you can actually navigate that. And that's what I'm looking with some of the Filipino migrant influencers in Australia and the way they talk about how to migrate to Australia and stuff like that. But again, that's also creating a backlash because of the media in Australia, ethnic media, also looking at why you're talking about that topic that's not actually covered, supposed to be covered in this country, but then you are actually covering that. So it's creating a space to talk about something that's not covered by the traditional or ethnic media in that particular environment. So they're creating new spaces of engagement, but also kind of like problematic in the sense that, you know, these representations can be reinforcing or challenging certain subjectivities or representations.
Thank you, Earvin. So I'm hearing from you the aspect of labor, the aspect of individualizing versus questioning the system. And of course, because they are very hyper-visible influences, the issue of surveillance. And off to Srikanth to cap off this section.
Yes, in my study, most of these rural creators actually undergo certain tension, what I call a tension. The moment we call influencers, we think influencers are quite rich. They show off things and they kind of, you know, they have different kind of lifestyle and all such. But when it comes to rural creators, they are kind of, you know, however, they have a huge online fandom and everything. They don't have this kind of, you know, their own kind of, they use public transportation and they use everyday kind of ness. So during my doctoral study, where I deployed a deep hanging out and staying with them creators every day, what I discovered was that fans often ask them, hey, you don't have car. Hey, why are you walking on this road? So a lot of these things, their fans and their subscribers often ask these influencers. So these people, when in my interview, these influencers told me that, you know, they are like, you know, they became famous because of their ordinary life, but the fans want them to be something else. They want to be kind of, you know, be show off, kind of very rich and kind of having a luxurious lifestyle. Another important thing is that, like I said in my previously, that most of these subcultural things, one of the very interesting element is that during 1980s and 1970s and these subcultural forms of cassette and CD cultures, scholars have argued that, you know, women participation was always absent present. And so is in digital cultures of rural digital cultures. There are certain social norms are there where women directly don't participate in this kind of production practices. In my own case study, I came across that the group which I worked with, which I've studied them, out of 15, 18 collective group, only one woman is part of this group. And that too, she's a old woman, 60-year-old Gangava. quite became popular. So when I pressed this question that why women are not participant in these creator cultures, most of them creators say that there are kind of certain taboos existing, that they don't come, they don't participate. So this kind of things still so surprising, given kind of when one traces the subcultural forms from 1980s to 1990s to now, platform culture, still the participation has certain social norms are kind of dictating. However, I would say that there is certain element of democratization. Still, there are certain creators are emerging, but however, the visibility is quite limited. So still predominantly one can say that these rural creator cultures are mostly dominated by men creators, and they are the one who is actually defining this kind of creator cultures. Thank you.
Thank you, Srikanth. Very, very interesting. I'll go backwards for you. The last thing I'm hearing from you is that whenever we talk about trends, we also need to evaluate the status. It could be that these trends were bona fide mainstream some time ago, but they're being challenged now. It could also that there are some trends that are emerging and new, still a bit precarious, but they're on the rise. The second thing we're hearing from you is the demands, the dictating, either from fan expectations, the realities of the job versus what these influencers want to do. And the first point from you was about subculture and the mainstream and the clashes between both. So we're about the halfway mark for this panel, and I'd like to remind everyone that there is a Q&A function you can use. We're also monitoring the tweets live to see if you've got any reactions, and we can address them to the panelists. But allow me to summarize some of the Q&A we have here and also across the DMs. I want to pick up on this point in particular. All three of our panelists have very beautifully highlighted the dynamic of going beyond the individual to look at systems, structure, and the macro. So it is at this point that I would love to invite all three of you to talk to us specifically about that bigger issue, that bigger system governing the influencer industry in terms of precarity. Srikanth has spoken to us a lot about platforms and precarity. Earvin perhaps about information and precarity. Jia maybe about gender and precarity. So whoever would like to go first, please go ahead.
Yeah, in my case, I looked at the platform precarity in the within the binaries of rural and urban. Especially what was happened with the rural creators is that most of the rural creators, despite having a lot of fandom and huge subscriber base, in terms of their negotiation with the sponsors, it became problematic. During my interviews, a lot of creators told me that they are underpaid when compared to urban creators. So a lot of this, though they do same kind of a labor of promoting their product. So most of these creators are quite frustrated with this sponsors saying that, still, since we are part of a rural setup, we have been not paid well enough. And in fact, they have discovered during their conversations with other creators in urban cities that, how much they are paid. So when they got to know that these creators are paid very less in compared to urban creators, these creators are kind of, trying to bargain a kind of a develop different strategies. For example, they have a set rates to, for example, if the corporate sponsor having a very good visibility in the market, they say that, we will only sponsor your videos only for particular price tag. So they're trying to do that, but during this time, what is happening is that they're missing out a lot of sponsors, because still sponsors are like not coming to these creators. So to overcome this platform precarity, especially depending on YouTube's monetization, is very difficult, because it's quite uncertain that how much money you get every month. It's very difficult. So creators have to depend on sponsors and other beyond platform sponsors, so that they can supplement money. So what is happening is that, this rural-urban divide is a very interesting thing, because creators are quite frustrated with this paying to the creators. Thank you.
Thanks, Srikanth. Earvin or Jia?
I think I will go first. Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, it's talking about precarity. That's in my thesis. Also, I literally just transformed this part into like a book chapter. So about so macro celebrity with influencers and precarity. So I found that's very interesting in my interview materials for my see this, just like some this my interviewees who are doing this like beauty, fashion, lifestyle, creative labor on social media, and they kind of like, so in the context of China, they take this like precarious work as a way to actually get some like control over their life, because so they are like this like standard Chinese middle class women, and for their parents, of course, like the ideal kind of like stable life for them, just to get a stable job like in government or become a school teacher and just to get married, and to have this like heterosexual family and just to have a stable life. But for these young women, apparently that kind of the parents' idea, that kind of life is not what they want. So they also like say a lot of this like, so the job markets in China, especially during COVID, it's actually become also precarious. So they kind of say doing this creative labor on social media become like a way they can, or at least they imagine they can control their life. So in this case, like what they always think is precarity becomes something it's actually not precarity. So I think it's interesting. It's not like there's this thought like it's not problematic, because of course they all know, and even themselves, they also acknowledge this might be not very realistic. This is very just like, not like everyone can get that success on social media, and also that success doesn't last long. So, but like, just to think that this kind of like women's agency, or to think like their life choices when you live in China as a middle class daughter, and you to negotiate that kind of the stable options which leave to women, is just to have this like stable life and job, and just more important to get married. So yeah, so I think in that case it is like really interesting to think, is that the like precarity in influencer industry, like we understand, is this like our understanding is like too male dominant or like too Western dominant, like in that space? I think just like really interesting, like to show that tension. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Jia. Earvin?
Yeah, because mine, Crystal, in terms of like precarity, there's actually two layers in that one. So the everyday precarity as experienced in everyday life, but also that informational precarity. So the informational precarity, that's pertaining to the information provided by, for example, agencies, governments, on how to migrate on the country, what the country is about, what they're offering, and stuff like that. But what's interesting now with migrant influencers, they talk about the nitty-gritty, the information that's not covered in those official channels. And they're basically showing the everyday life in the host country. And these are information not shown in any sanitized, very glossy website or kind of like platforms. But the migrants are actually exposing those kinds of lives that they have. But what's another layer of precarity is that the migrants are actually showing these audiences how to navigate precarity in the host country. And that's gravitating this aspiration to migrate to another country that, for example, if you're struggling in that host country, you can still survive by, navigating that precarity, by doing all of these steps as perhaps presented by that migrant influencer. So there's a kind of like layering when it comes to precarity with influencer culture. And that aspiration to actually migrate overseas is also propelled by obviously the lack of, jobs, opportunities back in the Philippines, compelling all of these Filipinos to look at what opportunities that can be accessed, in another country. And then they basically watch the videos of migrant influencers telling them that this is the life here and this is how you navigate the precarity. And this information is actually not covered in that kind of like information provided by the official channels, basically sanitizing how great to be in Australia or in another country. But then these are the lives of migrants navigating the everyday, precarious everyday living. Yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Earvin. I'm really learning a lot from all three of you. I really appreciate your time and your expertise, and like the detail in your ethnography and your work is really astounding. I'm gonna use my prerogative and my privilege as the chair of the session to summarize some of the Q&A, because I do think they're all pinpointing the issue of labor. One of the questions is looking at the angle of perception and disclosure. So do the creator self-disclosures change with audience perceptions? One of the questions is with regards to how we integrate sensitive or lesser known issues. For example, for women influencers, do they integrate more and more the conversation around domesticity and housework as a form of labor? And another one of the questions focusing also on labor talks to intimacy. As influencers become more established, how do their efforts at negotiating intimacy with their followers change? Now, for all three of our panelists, I do think we've covered some ground in regards to this. So if you like, maybe we can start off with Jia. In terms of labor, is there a feminist angle? And then with Earvin, in terms of labor, is there a migrant broker labor? And with Srikanth, is there a form of relational labor? Again, what we're trying to address here is the Groundhog Day element. What are we talking about over and over? And is there a need to break out of that cycle?
Yeah, I think that kind of like this I think it's talking about the domestic life, which is this mom entrepreneur. They like have been talking as well in the Western scholarship and also in other countries in India and China. We do see this like more and more full-time moms go online and post their everyday lives, and they this kind of like a lot of domestic labor. I think I still want kind to address that the complexity, and also just like Earvin said, the kind of like between the agency and the structure. Of course, and also like a lot of people already put their critiques, and I agree. So this kind of the promote this like real like really like neoliberal ideas of the like personal achievement, kind of to put away that the feminist concern, like like in like kind of like traditional gender rule, father becomes a bread winner and woman just like stay home, do all the like free domestic labor, like for free, don't get paid, of course. So I think yes, of course, this kind of like phenomenon. So you see like many like moms just who just like become this like successful, definitely going to distract like attention, people's attention from that kind of like feminist discussion, like from that kind of like the structural problems. But again, I think especially when we say this like study this like in context, for example in India or in China, or like I don't know, like in rural China or in rural India, in small town China, that's just going to like bring like a new angle to really like again, I think just again bring that tension between like agency and structure. So yeah, so my own research, I didn't really focus. I still like for some beauty, fashion, those like young women. So mostly it's that kind of like topics, not really domestic labor and the creative labor around there. But I just still think that would be the really interesting angle, is again to show the tension. Yeah.
Earvin?
Okay, so thank you very much, Gia. Sorry, I'm actually so engrossed listening to your talk. But in my research, I think that kind of like intimacy and also labor kind of like merging in that space. Well, obviously the videos are presenting the lives of migrants overseas, like the nitty-gritty, the details of their everyday lives, what they eat, the Filipino dishes that they consume in Australia or elsewhere, or even kind of like the labor of looking for job opportunities and posting them on their channels. And they're actually showing you what are the kind of like requirements that you can actually be preparing to migrate to that particular country. So these are kind of like labors in that particular space, but also creating intimacy to the audience. Intimacy in the sense that the audience is actually gravitating towards those information because those information are actually interpreted as a form of helping or solidarity or connecting, and the influencers are here to give you these opportunities for you to learn or access or something like that. So that's creating a level of intimacy. But another level of intimacy happening in the platform is the appropriation of the affordances. For example, the use of Filipino dramatic music that will be kind of like triggering that emotive connection to that audience by just watching that particular video, or even just using certain like graphics or kind of like voiceover, which Crystal, you did like with memes and templates and stuff like that. So they're actually appropriate to create the intimacy between the migrant influencers, but also the audiences. But I'm more interested in how that shared ground of we're all in this precarious situation, and that's creating the intimacy between the influencer in that host country, but also for an aspiring migrant in that home country. So that for me is a bind that creates that relationship between the influencer and also the audience in that particular practice of labor and intimate connections in the platform.
Srikanth?
Yeah, when it comes to relation labor, I just wanted to, before getting into relation labor, I wanted to tell that in India, stardom, fame, and this kind of celebrityness is part of only few segments. With the rise of platforms and kind of this TikTok and YouTube and Instagram, it somehow this kind of democratized, like everybody ordinary became famous and become micro celebrities. So one of the very interesting thing about this this phenomena is that that social creators are they have, like Nancy talked about, that it is important for them to survive to do a relation labor. But in my study, what I found was that relation labor in a way became a kind of problematic to rural creators. For example, I looked at the idea of selfie. That selfie is quite important to any celebrity, that a lot of people ask, a lot of fans and followers ask their favorite creators or stars to give selfie, and direct selfie from them. But during my fieldwork time, what I understood was that selfie become a kind of interruption in the productions. A lot of these fans and audiences come to their production centers. Since these people are accessible, unlike other mainstream celebrities, they are part of in a particular setting, whoever can go and can meet them. So this has become a kind of a problematic to rural creators, that they have to abandon this meeting their fans, because they are actually this practice is actually interrupting their own practices, because they have weekly, daily, and monthly kind of production. The production videos have to be uploaded, and they have some deadlines. So this relation labor has become, what of creators told me in my interviews, that if we give selfies to fans, they will be happy, we are also happy. But it has become a kind of everyday. It has become every kind of meeting them is some kind of interrupting their kind of everyday digital production. So I coined a kind of conceptualize this as a self-interruption, how it is actually interrupting their everyday digital cultures.
Thank you. Well, we're about to wrap up in the last 5 minutes. And again, reflecting on the discussions for today, I'm going to be provocative and ask you to give us a Groundhog Day sentiment or moral panic in your research in just one sentence. And then to play the devil's advocate, tell us again in one sentence what we need to bear in mind to challenge this perception or to push back on it. So let's go with Jia, Earvin, Srikanth.
So I think I just want to kind of like summarize, just to listen to women's and also LGBT groups' voice, right? Like just to recognize their agency and don't make like assumption or judgment, just say the like complicated nature of not only influencer culture, like of everything. So yeah.
Thank you, Jia.
I also agree with that agency is very important, and in the kind of rural creators also, that I feel that lot of participation from other genders also required. So it should be more of a democratic setting, and at the same time, if women start trying to start creating content, they most often they actually don't continue because of the trolls and other kind of comments. So it should be women creators need to be sustain their kind of digital culture production, means there should be a support and a kind of within the platforms.
Yeah, well, in my case, I mean, like in terms of like the moral panic, I think we need to understand that the emergence of migrant influencers is basically changing the landscape through which information is produced and distributed for aspiring migrants or already migrants. And in examining the practices of migrant influencers, we need to step back and look at the broader picture. For example, forces such as precarity, exclusion, marginality, and all of these kind of like issues surrounding that, and how those issues are actually shaping the everyday practices of what we call kind of like very creative, engaging contents. But behind that, there's actually a story that needs to be unpacked, and that gives us a critical vantage point to really think about the complexity of being a migrant influencer or an influencer in this digital age.
Thank you, Jia, Srikanth, and Earvin. We've had the privilege of hearing from all three really amazing emerging HDR and ECR scholars. That has been Srikanth Nayaka, recently submitted his PhD, any day now, going to be a doctor, who is assistant professor at GITAM, GITAM, in Hyderabad in India. We've had Dr. Earvin Cabalquinto, who is an ARC DECRA Fellow and Senior Lecturer at Monash University, and Dr. Jia Guo, very recently doctored, congratulations again, finishing at the University of Sydney in Gender and Cultural Studies. To wrap up, are influencers just vain? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But what do we have to bear in mind? Well, for one, when we look at these discourses, what locale are we looking at? Do these generalizations apply globally? Or do we have to look in specific contexts like the Philippines and migration? China with queer and feminist advocacy influences, or India even with the class divide with rural influences? Are influencers just vain? Well, maybe sometimes, but that's because they have to navigate precarity. In Srikanth's case, platform precarity. In Earvin's case, information precarity. In Jia's case, gender precarity. And behind the scenes of the perceptions of what we see, or as Earvin says, behind the screen, what's happening to sustain all of this work? It's labor. In India, we've talked about the rural divide with relational labor. In the Philippines/Australia, we've talked about migrant broker labor in navigating information systems and perceptions. And then in China, we've also had the feminist labor or feminist labors as we're working through multiple systems of oppression and intersectionality. I am very, very honored to have to share this time with you. Thank you again to Srikanth, Jia, and Earvin. We will now transit over to our panel 2. And with that, I'll hand the time over to Professor Kath Elbry.